During the 1920s, the United States experienced unprecedented prosperity, in part because the United States emerged from World War I largely unscathed, both physically and financially, compared to Europe. So the United States enjoyed a competitive advantage in the 1920s over the European nations that were struggling to rebuild their economies after the prolonged and devastating war. At the same time, during the 1920s, there developed an array of exciting new industries and new products, new technologies. The airplane, the automobile, the radio, the cinema. These were very fast-growing industries during the 1920s. And as a result, people began to invest in the stocks of these new industries. The problem was that the stock market was underregulated. And as the stock market rose in value, more and more people invested in the stock market, thinking that it was going to continue to grow permanently. In fact, some of the leading economists in the nations talked about perpetual prosperity in the United States. And as so often happens with the dynamics of a capitalist system, greed overtook reason. And as people grew more and more greedy, as they saw their profits rising, they continued to invest more and more in the stock market. Another factor was that taxes were very low in the 1920s, so more and more consumers had more money to invest because they weren't paying high taxes that they had to pay during the war years, and they were putting that money into the stock market. Finally, the unregulated stock market developed some practices that led Herbert Hoover, the president, in 1929 to talk about an orgy of financial speculation taking over the stock market. What he meant by that was that people were able to buy stocks in the 1920s on what was called margin, buy on margin. And what that simply meant was that instead of having to pay $100 for a $100 stock, people could buy that stock for only $10, and the rest was on margin. In essence, they were borrowing against their stock, assuming that its price would continue to rise, and they could pay for the stock with the profits that the stock was accruing. Unfortunately, all of that began to collapse in October of 1929, when suddenly all of this superstructure that was driving the stock market began to crumble and implode upon itself because it was built on fantasy rather than the reality of the American economy. In the fall of 1929, as stock prices plummeted, stockbrokers had to call their customers and say, "You've got to pay me your margin." Well, people didn't have any cash to pay their margins. In other words, they had borrowed money to buy the stock in the first place, and now they didn't have money because their stocks had collapsed. That created a terrible financial pinch that began to radiate throughout the economy as people became cash short because their stocks lost so much in value. It was during that fall of 1929 that the stock market plummeted so fast and so far that many stockbrokers and stock owners jumped out of buildings and committed suicide because it was so bad. So when it crashed, it didn't create the Great Depression, but the stock market crash did serve as a catalyst for the Great Depression because it revealed some of the fundamental problems with the American economy and American behavior during the 1920s that would spawn the prolonged depression of the 1930s.